Good afternoon, Masal Khair, ladies and gentlemen. I will be your moderator today. My name is Zarmeena Ansari. I'm an architect specializing in cultural tourism and working full-time on a bilingual organization, Joy of Urdu, and the establishment of a bilingual publishing house. I'm going to start by being a bit facetious. When ADA Magazine's publisher, Maria Aslam, asked me to moderate this session, I asked her if the common link between all the four panelists is me. Two of them have been my teachers. One, the subject of my master's thesis at MIT. One of them has written books about the region I live in, and one happens to be my editor, to whom I owe more than a few articles. But on a more serious note, this very important webinar on the current situation calls upon the experience of a panel of experts to make sense of the current times and share their thoughts about a post-COVID world. They have researched and written about architecture, urban design, and development. The proceedings of this webinar are as follows. We will introduce the idea of the series, Do You Know Your City? Then we'll ask each of our four panelists to introduce their theoretical journey and their learnings over the years, which can possibly help us make sense of this time, as ADA calls it, disconnect and discontent, this time of disconnect and discontent. And after the panelists have introduced their theories and the way they're looking at it, we will hope that this generates a discussion amongst them. And finally, we will answer the questions sent in by the viewers. So please feel free to do that. We will address them at the end. So to begin with, just to introduce what this series is, the ADA signature series, Do You Know Your City? Which explores the present unprecedented time and the new norm in the urban fabric that we call cities. It scrutinizes social disconnect and discontent. I would like to request architect and publisher of ADA Magazine, Maria Aslam, to give a brief introduction to this series of seminars. Maria is a friend and an inspiration. I call her the petite powerhouse. As the founder and editor-in-chief of ADA Magazine, she has pioneered the ADA Awards, the first of their kind in the disciplines of architecture, design, and art in Pakistan. Alongside her architectural and interior design practice, Artworks, she is also the chairperson of Pakistan's Institute of Interior Designers and has published a book in 2016, Interiors of Pakistan. And she has represented her country and profession on a multitude of platforms as juror, critic, convener, and speaker. Maria, please introduce the journey of ADA and the seminars, Do You Know Your City?
Well, I will take a few minutes because I think we have a stellar panelist amongst us, and I would rather that we talk to them and speak about them today. ADA started its journey from a publication house, but after a decade, we started questioning ourselves as to where do we see ourselves in the next 5-10 years, and what is it more that we need to do for the society or for the profession. And I think the only answer that came to us was being an architectural activist. And hence we jumped into that foray. And that's where our conferences and our series of talks kind of started. And we coined the Do You Know Your City? And we take this question to many cities. And you would be surprised as to the kind of conversation that has unfolded itself from historicity to urbanism to architecture, and the kind of dialogue that has actually gained precedent after these kind of sessions. And I think we'll come to that later. And of course, yes, apart from that, we also introduced the ADA Awards, the first of its kind from Pakistan, the Architecture Design Arts Award. As we realized that we were really not highlighting or recognizing the artists and the architects and the artisans from our country. And that was the major highlight that we wanted to actually take further to the international world and in the national media also, that these are the people who actually matter and impact our lives through their design, through their works. So now we are into our second cycle, and that's a different aspect of ADA's work completely. Coming back to today's talk and webinar, we are into our sixth session of DYKYC, and I will now request Zarmeena to actually introduce our panelists and take the talk further. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. So the first, we'll go alphabetically because, we have such a stellar panel. So we'd like to ask them all to look at the topic of this webinar in the light of their journey, how they felt about it from the beginning of their careers, and to what they've learned on the way, and has anything significantly changed over this period of lockdown and worldwide economic downturn as well. And how do they have any theories? How do they see us moving forward? That's the broad overarching kind of question we're looking at, but I have very specific questions that I'm going to ask them. The first person I'd like to introduce is Professor Ashraf Salama. He is a professor of architecture. He's currently the director of the Research Cluster of Architecture and Urbanism in the Global South, the head of the Department of Architecture since 2014 in the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow, in the UK. He was the director of research and consulting at Adams Group Architects in Charlotte, North Carolina, and has led 3 schools of architecture over the past 25 years in Egypt, Qatar, and the United Kingdom. Having authored and co-edited 12 books and published over 170 articles and chapters in the International Refereed Press, Professor Salama is the chief editor of ArtNet IJAR and co-chief editor of Open House International. His latest book is Architectural Excellence in Islamic Societies, published this month by Routledge. Professor Salama is a recipient of the 2017 UIA Jean Choumi Prize for Excellence in the Architectural Education and Criticism. The question, Professor Salama, that I have for you is that for me, I'm talking to you from Dubai, and of course, it's a little subjective perhaps because I'm very, very interested in your work in this part of the world. You had 2 books, so Demystifying Doha and Migrant Cities, in which you had looked at sociology, anthropology, environmental psychology, lifestyle theory, and you used this framework. And can you use the same framework into when you looked at it to understand people's lifestyle choices that eventually affect policy decisions, urban development and growth, and possibly provide us with another framework to speculate about the future of lifestyle choices affecting design in the future? And my second question, because it might be interconnected, so I'll ask it right now. Moving from the micro to the macro, from people's lifestyle choices to the macro, as the global economic downturn hits transient workers that make up about 80 to 90% of the population in the migrant cities of the Gulf, do you have a theory as to potential changes in growth and development in these regions?
All right, okay. Thank you very much for having me in this really important webinar. And the topic is a dear topic to me, and it is a pleasure to be among the distinguished colleagues. In answering your question, I just want to go global a little bit and try to see why we are discussing this, why social disconnect and discontent is an important topic. What kind of phenomena we are witnessing now that have social implications, where architects and planners should be involved. We see transformations in the structure of contemporary societies. We see issues that we never talked about 20 years ago. The rising needs of special populations, women, children, people with special needs. The idea of people with special needs is only 25 years ago. So in the history of architecture and planning and design, this is very new. The continuous crisis in housing and squatter settlements and the associated social problems, deterioration of the built heritage and the problems associated with, or the social problems associated with communities living in heritage areas. the rising complexity of large structures and the emergence of new building types. The idea of sustainability, which is also 25 years old, and the fact that the professional community only deal with it in technical terms and avoiding the cultural and social dimensions. The global condition that many cities in the Middle East and in the global South in general, from South America to Southeast Asia, are witnessing, and the associated loss of identity, detachment of local population and local context. Displacement of communities as a result of wars, as a result of civic conflicts or natural disasters. Many other problems. The need to understand migrant communities and transient communities in globalized cities. Income inequality and how this is manifested in the built environment, where you see very elite and affluent housing developments in certain cities juxtaposed, colliding with slums and squatter settlements. All these are social issues that architects, planners, designers are engaged with and need to be further engaged with. So in terms of the frameworks we used to apply to Doha and introduce the social dimension, we relied on two frameworks, and the two frameworks can enable a better understanding of urban dynamics, housing transformations, and housing choices. The first framework is basically stemming from the Henry Lefebvre theory of the production of space, and trying to look at the urban environment in terms of three types of spaces: the conceived, the perceived, and the lived, and how the three types of spaces must interact. The conceived is basically the space which is conceptualized by decision makers, social planners, and social scientists. The perceived is where development and interaction take place, is basically the interpretation of the conceived. And then the third type of space is the lived space, which is the space that impacts you and me, which is more subjective, related to meanings, related to attachments, related to understanding and use of spaces. And this is the social part of it. So the three types of spaces are really important to enable our understanding of urban dynamics, and they apply to any scale. We can use that framework to discuss a building or a small community or a city. So that's an important one that integrates the social dimension clearly. The second framework about building migrant cities and focusing on housing choices is more transdisciplinary and try to bridge the boundaries of some disciplines in sociology, anthropology, and ethnography, and looking at the understanding of housing and housing transformations and housing typologies from a sociological, from anthropological, and from ethnographic perspectives. The idea of habitus, the idea of status and past experiences, and how this impacts the way in which we understand and interpret housing and have housing choices. The idea of group grid structure and how the human preferences in terms of being part of the community or avoiding social pressures and social dynamics. You want to be away from the community or want to integrate with the community. This is an attitude based. And then the work-life mood, which relates to the types of work people have in terms of wage earner, career-oriented, self-employed, and how these dynamics have impact on the perception of housing, on the use of housing units, and at the same time on the future housing choices. So all of these dynamics enable this understanding really very well. The good thing about these frameworks, of course, we validated them in the context of Doha and the Gulf in the two books. The first was on Doha, the second was on 4 cities in the Gulf. But also they are inclusive. They can accommodate variety of issues based on the context we are examining or studying or designing for. So this is the general thing. So definitely they can help us project the future and understand the future with the social dynamics in it. In terms of what's going to happen in the future, related to your second question, it's really important. Of course, I don't have a theory because even if I have one, before like externalizing it, it needs to be validated and tested. But I would say 2 important issues. When we say transient communities in the Gulf, we need to classify it because it's not only about the labor class. Yes, the labor class is very important. It's about 60% of the 90% of migrant communities in general, but also there is low and middle income class, expatriate class, which are engaged in lower management jobs, for example. Highly paid and highly skilled expatriate professionals is a different categories. So these 3 categories are really important to look at in a comprehensive way. And to do that, we need to map some of the ideas related to livability. The intangible dimensions of livability would be really very important. How different groups associate with places, how different groups understand places and have choices about places. The second point is about the notion of urban community. There is a big issue in Gulf cities, especially in in smaller Gulf states, the capitals, whether we talk about Abu Dhabi, Manama, Dubai, or Doha. The notion of urban community doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because it needs time to evolve. The idea of a community needs time to evolve within a time frame, within a specific place, and within a shared value system. And that rapid exchange of expatriates doesn't enable that because the time span is very short. People go and stay 3-4 years and leave. So there is no opportunity to build this kind of community. But the interesting thing is that also it's a phenomenon unique to the Gulf and probably unique to most rapidly transformed urban communities or urban societies, is that expatriates need to engage together, those who have similar education backgrounds or similar cultural backgrounds. And this, while it's good in a way, it has negative consequences on the entire society because you end up seeing parallel societies. You don't see one society. You see parallel societies with possible tensions and possible paradoxes among these different communities. So this needs to be addressed in the future, how this is going to happen. The idea of designing a city for an unknown society is also very, very unique. So you're planning cities now, and you don't know who's going to occupy these cities 20 years from today. Will it be the same population profile, the same profile of the expatriate communities or of the migrant communities? So what is the role of architects and designers? I know that architects and designers are not responsible for all kinds of decision making. Some of them are political, some of them are governance, some of them are higher level decisions. But at the same time, what is the role of architects and planners within these dynamics would be an important thing. So the idea of urban livability and urban community would be important to project on the future of Gulf cities and how we're going to address different groups and different parameters within these groups. So.
Thank you, Ashraf. we'll hopefully open up this discussion amongst the panelists to see what you think about the future based on this framework of sociology, anthropology, ethnography, educating us about the kind of housing or lifestyle choices people will make in the future, where although the transient community makes only 60% of the 90% of the migrant population or the transient population, they are not the ones that the huge urban developments are addressing. So it's actually a very small percentage of the expats, and what they are trying to sell them in this transient kind of a space where they can't really have a real community is a kind of a created community. And that is what all the advertising and marketing also shows. We'll hopefully touch upon these questions a little later, but I want to get through to the next panelist. My next speaker is somebody who fed me coffee, rather lavazza and biscotti at his unearthly hour scheduled morning classes at MIT. He was one of the most dearly beloved professors there, the head of the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture, also my thesis advisor for my research on Kamil Khan Mumtaz, who is also one of the panelists. Attilio Petruccioli holds a degree in Oriental Studies from the Università di Venezia Sa Foscari. Is that correct, Attilio? Foscari? Did I pronounce it correctly? Okay, he is a full professor of landscape architecture. And
by the way, you have to say Foscari.
Foscari. Thank you. He's a full professor of landscape architecture, the Doctoral School of Architettura e Costruzioni, University di Roma La Sapienza. Petruccioli, Attilio was the Aga Khan Professor of Architecture for Islamic Societies at MIT and Director of the Aga Khan Program at MIT and Harvard University, 1994 to 98, among other institutions. He has been the Chief Editor of the Environmental Design Journal of the Islamic Environmental Design Research Center. He's written and edited 34 books, over 210 articles on these topics. As a consultant, he provided professional advice in the field of Islamic heritage and urban development in most of the Arab countries, amongst them Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Saudi Arabia. And following his retirement, Attilio founded a specialized research center based on his extensive private collections. This has actually been covered in a series of articles over 2 volumes of the ADA magazine. It is an absolutely exceptional resource. And while there are many books and articles and research materials available in, for example, Roach Library at MIT and others all over the world, to have just one library where everything is about the Islamic societies or the built the urban and architecture, urbanism and architecture of the Muslim world, to have all of this in one place. And I can see that Attilio is actually sitting in the Biblioteca in Trani. What I would like to ask him is actually a question that in his particular case, instead of moving from the micro to the macro, I'll move from the macro to the micro, and I'll come to the Biblioteca in the micro. The question that I have for you, Attilio, is that can the framework used in your study of typology and urban morphology, especially in traditional cities where work and home were often closely situated, give us hints about future directions? Also, Italy, which is one of the world's top tourist destinations, as well as a site of some of the world's greatest international art and architecture exhibitions like the Venice Biennales. How do you feel how will it recover post-COVID? Not immediately, not right now, what is happening right now as people seem to but in the longer term. And then in the second question that I have for you, moving from the macro to the micro, As the founder of Biblioteca Orientalis, what is the future of research libraries like yours, where students have to access non-digitized resources in person? How will restrictions on travel affect research choices? How do you see research going forward? But that's moving from the macro to the micro. You can address these questions.
Do you want me to reply to both questions immediately, or we have a second round?
We will have a
as you
second
wish.
round.
Yeah. It's as you wish. But these are the general questions that I have for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Moving from the general to the particular, I have to say that I dislike the rhetoric of solidarity that exploded with the coronavirus. We will be different, we will be better, we will love each other, and so on and so forth. It was a sugary debate, and of course, at the end, immediately at the end of the lockdown, we started to behave exactly the way we used to behave, in a very seeking way. But in spite of my pessimism of the human nature, I would try to find some gleanings, that contain some positive aspects and maybe could be developed, or it could be just a matter of discussion. That could be interesting. First of all, I think that definitely we have put aside the illusion that man can dominate the nature, because in the case of coronavirus, the nature dominated without any disturbance from the humans. And it was an assumption, that was quite arrogant, based on another illusion. It was based on the illusion that the technology, intended mainly in terms of commercial applications that you can buy and that would solve every problem, a vision of the life that we had based on you have a problem, you buy an application, you retrofit the problem. But that will, and then it will retrofit the other problem. Basically, it seemed to me that we had applied to our life the principle of the industrial plants. That means subdivide this is not true. In reality, a good plumber is a plumber that is not fixed with the problem of the tap that is leaking, but is able to repair the tap, having a general vision of the problem of the hydraulic system altogether, in such way that he will be able to predict the consequences of his actions into the system. Luckily, in a way, arrived the coronavirus, and at the beginning we tried to to care the problem with the same attitude. We thought it was a problem of lungs, but then later we realized that it was not only a problem of lungs, but that this disease was devastating all the organs of the human body. So the coronavirus confirmed something that we already knew, that the human body is an organism, which means that all the parts of the organism are connected by necessity, that you cannot eliminate one part or separate one part, otherwise you will disrupt all the system. System that, by the way, has a certain self-regulation, and up to a certain level is able to compensate, one part that is not working properly. Up to a certain level, after that it leaves. I'm convinced that a city is like an organism, actually. And maybe we have the opportunity of talking about that a bit later. The other issue that I want to put on the table is, well, no, sorry. I step back a moment. Let's talk on the problem of the typological studies, and we connect to the idea of the organism. The idea of the organism is connected with the idea of typological study. I belong to a school that is a shared philosophy, if you want, that we call the Italian School of Typological Studies, that actually looks at this problematic, not in the sense that we are cataloging, types, but in the sense that we believe that the type is something that evolves in time and changes. Number one, that therefore that all the cities are organisms that develop in time and change. And so the typological study is basically an instrument that allows us to understand how this organism evolves in times and changes. So change is the main question. Why we do this? We are architects, so we are supposed to design. So the main idea is that the principles of the design are not an invention, an individual invention of a single architect, but they are embedded into the city and particularly in the urban fabric. So we have to know how this process goes, because I'm convinced that this process, at the end of it, will deliver in a certain way the project, the future, the last phase, which is the design. So it's I see all this as a continuous process. Of course, continuous is a theory, but I mean, I believe that the project is delivered by the understanding of the process of evolution of the city and the urban fabric. Out of that, we have developed a theory that is also able to, that also as a method to read and understand this evolution without obviously excavating, because you cannot excavate a city that is alive, but reading the forms and the signs that are left on the present fabric, we can reconstruct all that. End of it. I don't give all the history of the theory and so on and so forth. Clearly, this is the only thing is that this is a big difference between the general attitude of the designers that belong to the so-called star system. That, on the contrary, they believe that the context, the city, is not important. It is just a place where they can perform their inventions. And this is a different philosophy. I strongly believe that there is space, on the contrary, after coronavirus, if we want to put the hands into our cities and we want to try to correct so many mistakes, we have to refer to this typology, this patrimony, if you want, of the that is embedded in the heritage, and not to the self and not to the personal inventions. The last problem that is directly connected to the approach that we have to the city is the problem of the schools. And the problem of the school is the School of Architecture. That is directly connected to the problem of making the cities, but also to this idea of organism that I have tried to introduce at the beginning. The Italian school, I entered into the Italian school when I was 5 years old. And at that time, it was a school that had an integrated vision between all the disciplines. History, geography, and literature, and whatever. They were studied at the same time, and all the teachers, used to make an effort to help these students to make a synthesis between these. So it was a school that I defined organic. And the same, when I went to the School of Architecture, there was a school that was, in which the disciplines that were taught at that time were hierarchically ordered, but also integrated, which means that not all the disciplines were the same. But if the target was that of helping students to learn how to design, the backbone, everything was all the disciplines related to the design, the studio, etc. And the other disciplines, not all, were, auxiliary, and they used to help, the design. So the history of architecture was not taught in abstract, but it was specifically taught for the designers. And in a different way, the same history in another school, school of art, school of fine arts, whatever, it was taught in a different way. It's only in the last 30 years that every discipline claimed its own autonomy, which means that history now is taught in the same way wherever it is, independent from the fact. This ended up in a sort of, all this attitude produced castling, which is a term that I discovered used in chess games. That means, building fences and reinforce the fences. And at the same time, produce the famous segmentation of the plumber, that I was mentioning before. I retired after 2012. In 2012, the law establishing and reinforcing the idea of the department abolished the schools of architecture. Now the situation is that you can a teacher can belong to different departments, and they teach in the program of architecture. A sort of, the school became a sort of physical container. It's not anymore a school. It's not anymore a place where a philosophy is shared, for it. It's not even a place where, because of the segmentation, it's possible to have an interdisciplinary work. And now, to finish, I would like to launch a positive perspective, connecting myself to something that Ashraf Salama wrote or said, I don't remember, about something that sounds quite interesting. That probably could be an interesting matter of discussion, if you want. He was talking, if I remember properly, of transdisciplinary attitude that should be introduced after coronavirus as a real conquest, and change of attitude. Transdisciplinarily means that the disciplines will be modified according to the relation that is established every time between themselves in a certain condition, if I understand that. Which sounds very interesting. It's something that could be a dream. In order to overcome the defenses that are established in the universities. Of course, in order, in my opinion, in order to achieve this transdisciplinary connection, if you want, collaboration between the disciplines, I think that we need what the old, first of all, we need what the Greek intended as a kind of intelligence that was called the metis, M-E-T-I-S. Metis was the dialectic intelligence, the ability to adapt to a change of condition, and the ability to find a solution quickly to a new problem that was arriving. The champion of the metis, as you can imagine, is Ulysses, obviously. it was not only smart, but he had the ability of being dialectic and quick in that sense. But I want to add that the old Greeks, they had another term for intelligence, and that was logos. Logos, on the contrary, is the systematic vision that creates a system out of a problem, that looks at the problem from the point of view of a system, or located the problem within a systematic vision. And of course, the champion of this logos is Plato. Okay, so in my opinion, if we want to achieve or try to achieve this transdisciplinary institutional organization, we have to apply both. And
you were asking if you had written it or heard it. You possibly may have heard it because it was. I recently heard one of the Bibliotheca Orientalis YouTube channel interviews, or it's called a Coffee with an Architect or Coffee with a Writer, and it was with Professor Ashraf Salama, in which he speaks about this interdisciplinary attitude of studying these migrant cities, first demystifying Doha and then migrant cities, and he looks at Abu Dhabi, Manama, Doha, and Dubai. And he speaks about this, and yes, so it's interesting that you were also echoing, reiterating this idea that it is not just one segmented piece of information like just typology or just something else that will give us possible understanding of where the city is headed, but possibly a combination of all of them. And it would be interesting to hear you in discussion again with him at the end. But I will get now to our next speaker, our next panelist. That is Kamil Khan Mumtaz. He is, I could possibly say, for many of our students, a star architect, senior architect, but also a star architect of Pakistan, but not one of the kind that you mentioned, where they look at the city as a palimpsest where they can perform their intentions, but in fact, look at the context. And I think that is what really differentiates his practice. He has been an educationist, an activist, also the subject of my thesis, which Attilio was the advisor for. He is, which we will hopefully publish as his monograph, inshallah. Kamil Khan Mumtaz is a practicing architect, educator, author, and pioneer in the movement for conservation of architectural heritage. He's a well-known name. Kamil Khan Mumtaz has been a leading influence in raising standards of architectural design in general and in the search for a contemporary appropriate architecture for Pakistan responsive to climate, economy, and materials, yet rooted in the indigenous culture. He currently serves as head of the architecture department at National College of Arts, and he is the author of Architecture in Pakistan, Modernity in Tradition, and has also been published in multiple publications about heritage and contemporary journals of architecture. He's the founder and president. He was the founder and president of Anjuman-e-Mimara, and I would like to say over here that as a student, the Anjuman-e-Mimara, before although this dates one, I must say that pre-internet, where at the click of a finger, you can see, for example, the Bibliotheca Orientalis YouTube channel, and you can see webinars and talks by architects and thinkers and academics all over the world. The Anjuman-e-Mimara was an amazing opportunity for a pre-internet generation of students to experience what was happening on the international front in architecture and urban design and in theory, and to be exposed to different ideas. Books were far too expensive, not easily come by, except for the secondhand markets where books were sent by printers from overseas if they had a mistake or something, and we would just go and buy them from the bazaars. But really, these seminars changed things, and he continued this activism. I mean, with his Law Conservation Society and many others. He was a steering committee member of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, 81 to 84. And he has been acknowledged at a national level. He was awarded Tampa Imtiaz, and then last year, the Sitara Imtiaz. These are in 2019, these are very, the highest civilian awards, some of the highest civilian awards that we have in Pakistan. And as I said, his instrumental, I would say, he was instrumental in bringing this international or global point of view, but in the regional context, to students who did not otherwise have that access. And so with him, I'd like to say that there was a small thing that happened in one of these decades ago, these seminars, and it's always stuck in my mind. And it's funny, or rather, it's strange that when we spoke about this webinar and we spoke about disconnect or discontent, I also thought about the people who are not discontented and not disconnected in this time from something that was said in one of these seminars. And it was that we've gone back to that mode of working in the traditional city, which had a smaller carbon footprint, where the place of work and residence, again, they were very close or sometimes the same. And I started asking people, and some of them who had a very contemplative practice, and I'm talking specifically about architecture, they found that the topic of this webinar is, although it's discontent and disconnect, that they did not identify with it. And then others, and I think including Maria, found that they had a more collaborative process, or others who are not in other fields, they found that the nature of the work, they did feel this disconnect that the title refers to. Others remain undecided to see what the pros and cons are of both. What I'd like to ask Kamil Saab is, what has been your personal journey, and what are your learnings? How do you feel that you've changed from the beginning, from when you started to now? And what has this particular situation demonstrated to you? And in case this overlaps, I will do the same, that I will ask my other question to you at the same time as well. And from you, I'd like to go from this micro of looking at, the contemplative practice, the traditional idea of the traditional city, of the workplace and the residence being in a very close proximity, to a macro level, because you were also the steering committee member for the Lahore Development Authority, or LDA's Master Plan 2040 for Lahore. What have you learned? What is different about that plan? So do you think that you could have predicted what was going to happen? And those, nobody could, of course, but could you possibly see the suggestions or the recommendations which are in this plan as being workable, or given the current situation? So I'll move it to you, Kamil Saab, now.
Thank you, Zarmeena. I will try to review, as you've asked, my journey, starting from freshly back from the Architectural Association, full of really fired up with the whole ethos of the modernist, modern architecture, modern art, modernism, as a very inspiring idea of human progress, development, based on science and rationality. So I began by from that position, both in my as a teacher, setting up the Department of Architecture at the NCA. Incidentally, I think you mentioned that I am still the head of the. No.
Apologies, that was a typo. I just read it out, and I know when I read it, I realized, but I thought I should clarify that
Yeah.
you were the head and you set it up at the National
Yeah.
College of Arts. Yeah.
Yes, but long ago, I was
Yes.
booted out, 1977. So, and that was the best thing that could have happened to me, because you really step out of the ivory tower of academia, and you realize there's a real world out there. So, in my practice, I tried to evolve a relevant idiom based on the modernist philosophy. And pretty soon I realized that there was something I was not quite getting. And that is that as a modernist, um, I went by the credo that modernism, modern architecture is not a style. If, in fact, the modern art, etc., begins by rejecting all precedent and style. And I found that what I thought I was making was an idiom that was neither Western or traditional, because that was the other tenet of modernism, that history belongs to the rubbish heap of the past. So we rejected our heritage and history, and I found that what I'm trying to say through my work is not being understood, and this led me to eventually going to bookshelves to find out what is the genetics of our sensibilities, because I found that there was something fundamentally missing. And so, to cut a long story short, I found Nader Adalan and Lale Bakhtiar's book. They actually, Nader very kindly gave that to me. And at the time, I just put it on my shelf. I thought, this is traditional Persian architecture. I'm not interested. But then I felt the need to learn something about our own traditions. That was the only source I had. And that really just opened a window into my mind. And that provided me the answer to this very troubling question, which was that the difference between the modern sensibility and our traditional sensibility has nothing to do with forms or materials or time, the past and the present. The difference is literally a fundamental difference on the basis on which these two worldviews are constructed. And as I became aware of that, at the same time, I realized that, wow, what have I been doing? It's certainly, at the same time, exposed the fallacy of the modernist position and the veracity of the traditional worldview. And so since then, my journey was, because we'd never been told anything about our own traditional bases for art and architecture. And so the journey was a quest to rediscover that knowledge, that wisdom that we had missed, and then to apply it as one learned to apply it to one's own work. So in the process, I was able to gain a much more holistic, larger perspective of everything. Man, his journey, the world, the cosmos, our place in it, the role and purpose of art and architecture. And the more I traveled along this path, the more I became convinced that this was the right path. Of course, it was quite often quite lonely. One kept looking back over one's shoulder and finding that nobody else is coming along this path. And then this COVID episode happened. How did it influence? How did it force me to review? Well, it actually reinforced all of the things that I had come to believe and believe in. So for me, it was really a very vivid reminder of really, as Attilo mentioned also, our hubris. We think we are Superman going to masters of the universe. We will design a new world from scratch, and this is so arrogant. And it takes an invisible tiny organism to teach us that lesson. And so what it has taught us, really the way I relate with what this organism has taught us, and our work as professional architects and planners or in any other field, is the question of normality. Because now, as we have got over the initial shock of this pandemic, immediately you found such discourses, seminars, webinars. The main topic was what will it be when will we get back to normal? So the whole focus was on getting back to normal. And this question, I think for us, is the biggest lesson that this pandemic has taught us. The question of what is normal? And to realize that wanting to get back to what we'd been doing and calling that normal is insane. That was the farthest you could get from normality. What we had constructed was an aberration, an abnormality. And so for me, the lesson of this pandemic is that it has forced us to stop in our tracks, stop what we've been rushing around with. And within the first 2 weeks, we found in Lahore, Lahore is amongst the 5 or 3 most polluted cities in the world. And we hadn't seen the blue skies for years. And suddenly the skies cleared out. The quality of the light changed. It was miraculous. You could actually see the flowers, the trees. You could actually hear the birds because the background noise of the traffic suddenly died down. And this was a huge awakening. This is what nature was telling us. Hey, stop what you're doing. And nature, how quickly she heals herself. immediately bounces back. Attilio, from Italy, we heard in Venice, the fish had come back into the canals. All kinds of things. There was a fox photographed outside Downing Street. Amazing insights that nature was giving us, telling us how far we had strayed from normality. So that for me was the lesson. Now, looking forward in how I appreciate how a lot of people are agitated and worried on both counts on how they can get back to doing what they were doing so happily, or worried that will the world ever get back to that normal, and has it been forever transformed, and will they never be able to do those things, and how are they going to deal with the new world? So these are, yes, huge worries, no doubt, but for me this is a very soothing and calming moment.
I think that when I meant the contemplative practices, I did, yours was one of them. What about the Lahore, the LDA master plan for Lahore 2040? What are the learnings? Do you think that what you have helped to steer it to? It's apparently, speaking to you earlier about it, it was one of the most different plans from what is different from before, first of all, because for the audience who doesn't know, what is different? And in this, I don't know, during COVID or post-COVID world, do you think it's going to be successful? Because when you were working on it, COVID hadn't happened.
Yes. Now, what I learned, amongst other things, about urbanism, the city, and what I mentioned about normality, is that for a planner, the modern planner, the method is to review the past data and its trends and tendency, and to project to where the scenario is going, and then to plan for that. So this is simply called the incremental method of planning, where you project the trends learned from the past into the future and plan for that. One of the things that I had come to understand, that this was a crazy method of planning anything for many reasons. So what was the alternative? And I'd been trying to bring this up in wherever the occasion permitted, and to get people to understand that what we should be planning our cities for is not the projected future according to the trends that we have been experiencing, but to recognize that the city, far from being an engine of economic growth and development, is, to use Attilio's metaphor, the city is an organism, Attilio, but that organism, I realized very clearly, is a parasite. The city is not sustainable. No city, by definition, in the world is sustainable. It produces nothing but rubbish, mountains of it. And the only way that it can subsist is to draw from its host region all that it needs to survive. And in turn, a symbiotic relationship between this parasite and its host would be where the parasite gives back equal value in terms of services. So the city is a service center for a region. So amongst, and that we should begin by defining what is a normative city. And we had that discussion in the early days of the internet through an email discussion. There was a very interesting debate on the tradition. If these are the traditional principles, could you apply it to a city? And so we did that exercise. We actually did a theoretical traditional model for a city. And we found that a city should be a normative city, should be limited in size, not more than 2 kilometers across, and in its number of citizens. There should be not more than the number that can be collected in one place, and every face can be recognized. So, but above all, it is a pedestrian city and an integrated city. The modern planning idea is the reductionist idea where you break down the structure of the city into its components and say this is industry, this is administration, this is housing, this is recreation, and you zone these things, green zones and purple zones, and you fling them out as far as possible because they don't want to interfere with each other. They need their own environments. But then what you do, you just connect them with mechanical transportation. So the whole planning exercise throughout the 20th century, later part of the 20th century, has been, you begin with a transportation, a roadmap for the motor car. And then you designate zones and fling things apart. So it's based on segregation and high tech. And we realized that, and as the global warming and climate change issues became more and more into the front of our consciousness, what the scientists realized was that the biggest polluters, the biggest consumers of the world's resources and the biggest polluters are the cities. So, and I look at why this is so, it's because of a segregated plan. You're planning for machines, you're planning for high tech, for high rise, low density. And here we have a different model in the traditional city, which is not open-ended like Doxiadis' Dynapolis, forever and forever you keep on expanding, unlimited. But it's a finite, limited space and population. And it's walkable. And everything, residence, workplace, recreation, culture, industry, it's all related within that walkable distance. So it's integrated in terms of land, in terms of use, functions, integrated in terms of class and occupations. So when I found myself just a few months before the COVID hit us, on the conference table where a committee was asked to start working on the next master plan for Lahore. The interesting thing is that by the end of this discussion, this was by the way, a completely ad hoc citizens group. Across the board, there were doctors, developers, engineers, planners, architects, administrators, all kinds of people just thrown together and given the task of, okay, we have to make a new master plan for the city by law. You tell us what you would like the city to be. And by the end of this exercise, what we came out was a city designed not for motor cars, but for people. A city that is primarily pedestrian. A city that is a center for civilization and based on charity, love, beauty, justice, equity. Nobody mentioned we want a city as an engine of economic growth and industrialization and progress and development. Now, in other words, surprise, surprise, this, it was a consultative committee, came out with precisely what we had been saying in the Lahore Project, in the Conservation Society, in the Anjuman Maran. And this was like a bombshell. I just couldn't believe that this was happening. Amongst the principles that this group came out with, 5 principles. Amongst them, this planning exercise should be a participatory citizens' involvement. And of course, sustainability and heritage, amongst other things. And of course, the economy. You can't have a city which is not economically viable. Right in the beginning, when we reviewed the previous plans, we came to a consensus that they'd all failed. There'd been several master plans for Lahore. Every one had failed. Why? Because nobody owned those plans. Those plans were built in the usual way. You get a bunch of consultants, experts, you give them the terms of reference, usually drafted by the World Bank or some such agency. They collect the data and sit in their studios and design, make proposals. And we complain, oh, this green area that was designated in the master plan has been taken over by the Defense Housing Authority. Oh, this street, which was supposed to be an urban motorway, has been encroached upon by these vendors and small shopkeepers. And we said, but did anybody ask them what kind of city they wanted? The result was that nobody owns the kinds of plans that we planners make, and we could totally alienated from them. Talk about discontent and alienation. There is a complete discontent and alienation between the cities that we planners plan and the people who inhabit these cities, because the planners never ask the people what kind of city they want. And this was the first time that actually this monstrous, corrupt institution, this giant, huge cesspool, had begun this exercise not by appointing consultants to plan the city, but by asking the citizens what kind of city they wanted.
It's similar to, I think, what Ashraf spoke about in migrant cities, about how they went to the micro level and started talking about the people who actually inhabit the spaces using sociology and ethnography and anthropology, and looking at how people actually use the city. What you meant, that when people are encroaching, they're encroaching because they use it in a way that is different from what the planners have thought that they would use it as, and that is something that they speak about, the framework that they used when they came to that research. And you are mentioning something similar, where you're saying that in the very first time in all these years of failed master plans for Lahore, they called for, or at least tried to make it a more participatory citizens exercise. If my understanding is correct, the master plan is complete, the 2040?
No. This was the first step,
Okay.
which was an ad hoc consultative group.
Okay.
And the fruit of that first step was a vision statement.
Right.
What is the vision of the city that we want?
And you had
that
mentioned
was,
that they wanted something that was pedestrian, etc. So, and you mentioned that in this COVID, what you had learned was that what you had also in your private practices realized, that this thing about the city as a machine, as something that produces rubbish and pollution, within 2 weeks, people could finally see the sky in a smog-laden, one of the most polluted cities in South Asia. And so it proved that point, that this kind of development was not sustainable. So I suppose maybe we should open the discussion after we speak to Maria about where do you see Lahore going, and where does Attilio see Italy going, and where does Ashraf see the cities of the Gulf going with all this economic downturn? And Maria, what were your learnings in the seminars that you organized? And then maybe this can be discussed amongst you all in the discussion segment of this. So is that okay, Kamil Sahab? I'd like to, so maybe this can be something that you guys discuss. It's a very important question. So what I'd like to do is, I'd like to quickly introduce Maria. I've already introduced her. But what I'd like to ask her, for those who joined late, she is the architect and publisher of ADA magazine. And they started these series of seminars called Do You Know Your City? And it started off in Karachi, and I was actually there on the first one. And I have to say that it was not just myself, but it was the first time many of us born and brought up in Karachi had ever seen the jaw-dropping frescoes on the ceiling of Karachi's prayer hall by the artist Sadiqain. Or even heard about the myriad issues that affect this mega city in such amazing detail. And while the previous, and then they took it to other cities in Peshawar, KPK, and Islamabad, and Lahore, etc. And while the previous seminars looked at individual cities, this particular one, Maria, my question to you is, what do you hope to learn from a discussion between such a geographically diverse panel? We are not, do you know your city is more of an abstract thought as opposed to an individual city as it has been in the past. And I'd like to ask you to please ask the panel what you hope to learn that will inform this discussion on our individual cities, this broader discussion of the urban landscape.
Thank you, Zarmine, for this very relevant question. And thank you to all my panelists on behalf of myself and of ADA for such a diverse talk that is so much required to our understanding of what is currently happening, and listening to all of you and your perspectives regarding the city as an as an organism, as where it takes us in the future, and how do we cope with the current times, be it whether we are sitting wherever in the world. I, on a personal level, kind of struggle in today's times, and as has been discussed by our panelists, as one says that these are the best of times or these are the worst of times, whichever way, I myself struggle as one day I would be great and reflective and contemplative and at peace with myself, and the other they're totally frustrated, not knowing how to move beyond one hour to the other, even in work or in my personal life or whatever. But then of course you have to give me the benefit of being that contemporary generation which is so not so patient, I'm still learning about myself and learning how we glean things, or understanding of what was and what was hidden, and that realization has to come. But my thought was, as we went from one city to the other, we kind of physically, I felt there was a physical connect, and there were physical layers that were kind of peeled off from the city and were presented to the audience, and vice versa. Whereas in today's time, in the current times, when we are so restrictive to the technology, wherein we have to have this discussion via sitting on our own confined walls, how do we, and coming to your question before I proceed, that what is it that I wanted to learn, or my audience also to learn, was that from that so visual and majestic and experiential and tactile quality or nature of architecture that we know as architecture, and the city also, how we experience the city, how we maneuver ourselves in the city, how that is taken away in just one fine day when we woke up and we realized that we were confined to wherever we were. So how will a city, or how will architecture develop a new spatial understanding? Is this what we are looking for? Or are we also in the same time trying to reinvent, reconfigure a city and how we interact and reciprocate and understand and maneuver the city? I mean, these are the questions that were in my mind when I was thinking of disconnect and discontentment. And as I see the kind of questions that are coming my way also, that's exactly what our audience is also looking towards you, trying to understand that when we say the old norm and the new norm, and how do we cultivate, or how do we understand, or how do we fabricate the new norm? So I am here more to pose questions rather than to give you answer, because I with all the seminars and the conferences that we had conducted, I felt that, and all our lives, as we have been told, that architecture is supposed to be experienced, that you have to visit so and so city. Unless you have visited Venice, you wouldn't know what Venice is. So if you take that away from your lives, okay, maybe this is transitory, this is a temporary time, that's fine. Now that even if we go back and when everything is fine and hunky-dory and everything is under control and we find a cure to the pandemic, will we react in the same way? As Attilio kind of mentioned, that will we go back to the way we were and act with the city and amongst ourselves as if nothing happened? Or do we have to kind of find a spatial understanding amongst ourselves and amongst the newer buildings that would come up, or the older structures? Do we have to redesign or rethink on our design philosophies? These were the thoughts that I had in mind, and I will leave that open to our panelists, because like I said, these are the kind of questions, as I look down on my screen, coming up my way, though there have been some very, very pertinent questions for Ashraf, Attilio, and yes, there for Kamil Mumtaz as well. But I mean, this is the thought that I leave with you, and whoever wants to pick up. I mean, I do have a question with you. How do you want to formulate the new norm of architecture and or urban planning or city planning that Kamil Khan was, actually discussing a few minutes earlier? If we can have some thoughts from you all on the same.
We have a specific question. Perhaps Professor Salama can start. There's a question for you, that you mentioned that you based your study on Gulf cities, on habitus, amongst others. Such theories were established since the 60s and 70s within the postmodern era. How applicable are such theories in reading the transformations of the global and post-metropolitan cities? Maybe when you answer Maria's question, you could address this question from the audience as well. You have to unmute yourself, Ashraf.
Okay, do you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Can I just reflect on a couple of points before I answer the question of about the use of theories? One important thing is that that notion of the normal versus the new normal versus the stable normal and all these. It's very difficult and it's almost impossible to define what is normal, because once you define it, you will standardize it. And once you standardize it, then you are devoid of context, people, and all these. So the normal maybe can have some constants, as we say, thawabit, and then all of it is variables based on people, context, rules, regulations, and all of these. So that's an important point. I'm very pleased to hear that there were roots. I was not familiar with this until you mentioned that basically the idea of logo and metis are there. It's just our problem that organizations and education systems and professional systems tend to develop mechanisms to serve their interest rather than the interest of the discipline. So when we look at the university system, it is decomposed and fragmented into courses, curricula, schools, departments, and things like that, and that doesn't serve the discipline and knowledge itself. So I'm just reflecting on these points. We have a global condition, and we have technology, and we cannot fight these. It's not in our hand. So the point is how we react positive to these, how we try to capitalize on these, and take whatever is positive possible from that positive, and then move forward with it. The question about the theories, any theory is, in most cases, is not context bound. So a theory is just a general conception that either prove valid or just introduced as a speculation, as a conceptual framework. So the point, we can take any theory, whether developed 2,000 years ago or 10 years ago or yesterday. The point is, the theory is a body of abstract concepts. How we operationalize these concepts and how we contextualize them into Gulf, Global South, South Asia is the issue. So I think the applicability of any theory is possible if we manage to operationalize it well. So that's the response to the question. So I think they are applicable basically to the context of the Gulf, depending on how mechanism or what tools we have followed to operationalize them.
Also, going on to the questions, Attilio had mentioned that people, it was funny, you said that you dislike this sugary debate of solidarity and your pessimism of human nature, that people, and it has been seen in Italy, that people have gone back to things in a kind of a, like a spring. You press a spring down, it'll jump even more. And that has happened in some things, but again, it has not happened across the board. I think it's you can't. It really does depend on some people are for sure changed forever, and others will go back and do the same things much in the same way. And somebody has asked the same thing about this normal. What is the normal? And Kamil Saab had, somebody says that he struck an amazing point, which I've been asking myself, what is normal? And who defines normal? Normal for whom? And it's, and somebody says that, is this normal model bringing us back to the totalitarian approaches of modernity, which proved to be inefficient? Because, as Ashraf said, if you say what is normal, you define it, and then it becomes a kind of what's the word you use? It becomes the standardized. Exactly. It becomes a standard. And so, when you're talking about the normal, I mean, we can debate. My question is, we can talk about these, answer this question: who defines normal? Normal for whom? Because I think it's almost a rhetorical question. I don't really think anybody can define that. I think it's more of a rhetorical question. When you talk about the new norm, or how people will behave. Of course, it's all speculation. We can talk all we want amongst ourselves. The question is, who is going to make the policies based on these discussions? And will they change? And do you see them changing based on the way people are behaving?
I suppose this requires me to step in here on the question of what I mean by normality, norm. In my mind, it's very simple. What we had come to believe was the normal state of humankind was a condition of endless progress, development, growth, evolution. And the question really is that a norm? Is that the normal state of being for humankind? Well, my realization, I say very clearly, is that this is an impossible, irrational, insane, mad idea. It is suicidal and self-destructive. No change can continue endlessly in one direction, and that is growth, progress, development, evolution. Anything, of course, now this means to understand, and when I say normal, it is in relation to the nature of change. So here is the modernist paradigm of the norm as being continuously progress, and we continue everything to progress, development. Anything in a finite universe, if it continues to grow, it has to reach a limit. It cannot go forever. And it will either burst those limits and go pop like a balloon, or it will fizzle out and the air gets out. So it's either entropy or going across past the limits. So what is change and what is normal state of being? As we know, the only constant in nature is change. But the change, if there's one thing we should know about anything in the universe, is the nature of change. No change, as I said, goes endlessly in one direction. Things fluctuate between a range of normalcy. Typical example, you get a fever, your temperature goes up, and then you take some medicine and it starts coming down, and then it goes below normal, and there is a normal there. So it's not that it stays absolutely constantly at that normal. It's continuously fluctuating above and below, but it keeps coming back and stays within the range of where it can bounce back to from its deviation. And so for any species, any living organism, there is a stage of coming into existence, which is an infinite change from nothing to anything. It then evolves, grows, develops, but not endlessly into anything. It grows and develops into its normative condition. It endures for a period of time, not forever. And then it goes out of existence. So what I call the norm is sustaining the normative state. And that is a very clear defined limit, both above and below. There is so much space that you can use, so much water that you can drink, so much food that you can eat. There is such a range of temperature that you can bear. That's the normal range. Now, then I said, you take a longer view of human history. 300,000 years, as far as the anthropologists tell us, man has been around. And he has retained that state, that normative state. Not taking beyond his needs, not polluting, not depleting, but retaining a harmony and balance with nature. That is the norm. And the first blip in that journey was with the Agrarian Revolution, where we found we could produce more than we need. But that was still an excessive production surplus, but within the normative range. You could keep coming back. You didn't cross the limits. The first time that with the machine, industrialization, man can consume and produce not just more than what he needs, but more than the capacity of this planet to replenish what we consume. And this is going beyond the normal. Now, in the post-industrial age, consumerism, we have gone way beyond that. We have crossed so many tipping points. And you say, are we going to get back to normal? My hope is that we would be shaken into the realization how far we have to get back. But my fear is that it's too late. We'll just get back to destroying ourselves and the planet and all the other life forms in it.
So I have that's a pessimistic note. And let me ask another pessimist on the panel, Attilio, as his self-professed pessimist. What do you think, Attilio? You think that the same is going to happen?
No, I will not try to be pessimist. Okay, again, about normality. I don't know what normality is, but probably I know what non-normality is. The competition that is now going on in the cities of the Gulf for the brightest, the tallest, the longest, the smartest, and so on. In few words, for the never seen before, seems to me not normal at all.
Yes.
I think that probably normality is something that approaches or is closer to the idea of good common sense. From our perspective, when I say Europe, I live in Europe. From our perspective, definitely we learn from the cities of the Gulf what we don't want to be or what we don't want to pursue. We are not interested in to be magnificent, probably, but I think we should be interested into maintaining and repairing what we have. That is the real problem. You know, we have cities now that are old, and besides the heritage that is preserved and conserved, and also has a high value also in terms of economy and tourism. But all the rest is a fabric that was built 50, 60, 70 years ago, that now has serious problems of collapsing. It is obsolete. It has lost most of the economical value and so on. So I think that the normality in our case would be that of taking care and try to repair it. This is my wish. I don't have recipes, you know, definitely for the post-COVID thing. But I think that something. I hope that some good common sense will be born out of this calamity. Let's say there are little signs. You know, for instance, there is an interesting law that has been passed in Italy recently because of the virus. It's called Eco Bonus 110. In few words, it's a bonus or a credit on taxes that is given by the states. If you take your house, you make the insulation, you improve the performances in terms of climate and so on. You change your plants and you improve them. And you highlight the resiliency of seismic to the seismic of your house and so on. Up to this is just the usual bonus. In German they do the same. But there are interesting things. You can the bonus can be given to others. Suppose you can give it to the bank, you can give to the contractor, you can give to the insurance. If you don't have money, for instance, to do that. And 110 means that if the contractor takes the bonus, you know, they have a double profit. They earn in the sense that they make the work, and they get the 10% plus, you know, the 100% of credit that is given, which is very interesting theoretically and so on. But can be extended also to other works that you can do in your house, you know, so that it means that you will have a different discount. But at that point could be interesting what? It could be interesting to pull down the obsolete building and so on and rebuild. And that is an opportunity probably to renovate our cities without incredible interventions and so on, with the participation of all the owners, direct participation and the last thing that is interesting of this thing is that the movement of the money can only be traced. I mean, can only be through to the bank, through the checks, no black money. Okay. Which is a revolution. In Italy, most of the building construction goes through the black money. Okay, but now, since it doesn't go through the black money, you know, the contractor has no more interest into making discounts on the tariffs of the construction. They will get the full tariff. So they will earn, you consider that instead of making a discount of 40%, they will get full price. The architects, they can finally have their own profit in the sense that instead of making incredible discounts just to get the job, they will simply practice the tariffs and so on. The banks, they will have double profit if they assume this credit and advance the money to the owner. So, that's very interesting. Of course, it will never be done in Italy because Actually, we are not able to implement good laws. This is the
I was
problem.
about to say,
But
what a
maybe
fantastic.
if some Swiss people hear me, they can apply in a normal country like Switzerland, and it would be fantastic.
In fact, this brings me to the question that we received through Facebook. And somebody asks, I assume it's an architect, and it says that at this moment in time, putting city planning to the side, how does an architect contribute on a micro level to the problems being faced by a variety of industries? And I think you just mentioned about, but this is again, it's a policy decision, it's a law. The architects would then but where this law doesn't exist, can architects do something? I guess it's a question to everyone on the personal level. What can they do to contribute to the problems being faced? And
well, if I can just offer my own personal practice, I have, as far as possible, I follow these principles, in which, as I say, are completely synchronized with the realization of the crisis that we have pushed ourselves into. And that is realizing that the cause of all of these crises is industrial production, and particularly the global corporate capital. We try to use, as far as possible, indigenous materials, no imported materials, and definitely not those produced by global corporate capital. As simple as that.
actually, there is something I can add to it about your practice, where there are a lot of traditional building systems that you have not only explored, researched, but reintroduced, not just as a sort of which somebody might say, oh, well, that's a sentimental, but in fact, it's a very scientific approach, because when you introduce your Pakka Kali, for example, as you did in the Chandbagh school, where this material that is on plaster, a traditional plaster that's covering the internal walls, it's a hygroscopic material and brings the temperature down by about 2 degrees. It's a huge thing in a place, in a country where we have load shedding or electricity outages as well, and very high temperatures. And that is a traditional method that was lost, but was reintroduced in this big school instead of chemically produced paints, which don't have the same effect. So I'm not sure if it still continues over there. This is some time ago. But also another thing that you do in many of your projects, and it's happened with trial and error, is the use in Lahore of a traditional system of the flat domes, which removes the necessity of reinforced concrete ceilings and floors, and you don't use to cover spans to have concrete. So you just use flat domes made of the locally produced bricks. So you do away with that, and again the carbon footprint becomes very low. So yeah, so looking at, I suppose, as you say, local materials would help in this issue of pollution. COVID has taught us how terrible this problem was in everywhere, including in Lahore. So the next, there's another question, and this question is for Professor Salama. It says that you mentioned that Gulf cities lack the notion of urban community. And don't you think that this is a characteristic of the Gulf cities? And the person, Abi Alham, asked that the issue is that governments in their conceived plans and policies don't address but rather intensify the segmentation of society.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Please.
Ashraf, if I may add to the same question, because this has been asked by the audience for you specifically. When you mentioned, if you can shed more light, when you mention unknown city versus a global city, or can you draw similarities on that too? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the two questions. Two important things. Yes, the Gulf cities are very diverse and very divided, even without the expatriate communities. If we look at the entire composition of society in many Gulf cities, before the oil boom of the 70s, Gulf cities are formed of tribal groups. And tribal groups that belong to specific families, and some of them have roots in India, some of them have roots in East Africa, some of them have roots in Persia, and some of them are native from the land and coming from the Najd or Saudi Arabia and the heart of the Saudi. So it's by default a divided, I wouldn't call it divided, but by default a very diverse society, and has its own history with tribal wars and tribal affiliations that took place from, let's say, 1870 up to 1950s and 60s. This is embedded in the planning system of Gulf cities. Add to that the complexity of expatriate communities coming, but they don't have choices because typically they come for an employer, and that employer, whether an organization or a company or a person, they come for an employer, and the employer mandates where they're going to live and where they're going to function and how they live in the city based on housing allowances. And so basically the expatriate communities have very little choices unless they are from the highly paid, highly skilled groups. So that's one important thing. So the planning system is catered to the local and the local needs and doesn't address the expatriate communities at all, unless from a profit-making perspective. So, and how money will be circulating from this unit of the government to that unit of the government. So there is also that real estate bubble, and the money keeps moving between organizations and between employers. So that's an important point. The idea of an urban community, we don't have to create it. Yes, we don't have to create it. But I would say we need to create or enable the mechanism for it to happen. So we don't create urban communities, but we create mechanisms, whether social infrastructure, whether avoiding this collision between the poor and rich, the foreign and local, and all these aspects. So we don't need to create it, but we need to create mechanisms for it. The unknown city or the unknown society is there, is definitely there. Of course, it doesn't apply to a country, for example, like Saudi Arabia, because the local population is the bulk, is basically 70%, and the expatriates are known from day one. They are guests. So there is no confusion about this. In other Gulf countries, there is confusion about this. People imagine, oh, welcome to your second home. And then, no, this is not your second home. You're also a guest. And being a guest, certain rules apply to you and doesn't apply to everybody else, which is also a phenomenon that you wouldn't see in many other cities. So now you're designing for a specific set of dynamics, expanding Dubai or expanding Abu Dhabi or expanding Doha for the current dynamics. But you don't know who's going to be there after 10 years. What kind of population, what kind of profile, what kind of jobs they will have, what kind of housing they will be interested in. It's really a difficult question for local governments to be able to answer. and I don't know, and I don't have an answer for that question, but I would say all cities in smaller Gulf states will struggle to sustain themselves in the future. That's my response.
I would say that you're right. We're already seeing that with the number of businesses that are closed. Although, again, I'm extremely fortunate to live in this little bubble of the UAE, where they were able to, they haven't, because they were able to control the spread, and they had a very, very strict lockdown, and they're opening up now. But it did affect many businesses. It affected the transient workers, not just the migrant workers who were the labor class, the 60% off the 90%, as you mentioned, but also the highly paid expat workers, because their packages included astronomical housing allowances, schools for their children, international schools, which are some of the ridiculously priced ones anywhere in the world. There are also rules. I wonder if they will change, which are unprecedented, which you don't see anywhere else in any city that you mentioned, Ashraf, about. For example, in some cities, the locals pay a subsidized rate for electricity and water, and therefore their consumption of it is completely different. Because it's not just a small percentage. It could be like you pay a few hundred dirhams, and the expats are paying 5,000 dirhams. That is the range. That is the, it's the expats are kind of subsidizing. But then again, you're a guest in your second home, and you might be asked to leave at any time. At the same time, there are amazing opportunities and real effort by the government. For example, even in the arts community. To reach out and to try and support artists, for example, the kind of work that we have seen in the UAE. I'm not sure if other places would be able to replicate that. So there are two sides of this two coins. Two sides of this coin. This has been. I'm not sure how long, Maria. How long are we going to go for? Because we are now at 2 hours.
Yes, we are
It's
at
been a
2
very,
hours.
very interesting discussion.
Conversation.
And why don't I leave you to ask your questions to the panelists?
Yes.
Based on your previous seminars, do you know your city? Do you know the global city?
I mean, with the kind of questions that are coming my way privately, I'm surprised. I mean, hearing Ashraf out on his thoughts about the unknown city, and I somehow feel that all cities these days are kind of moving on the same path, and we are slowly eroding our history and identities. And like Kamil Khan said, our own ethnicity, we are just breaking the bubble and moving towards entropy and to our limits. I would like to ask Attilio, what are his thoughts on the global city? Is there a globalized city or something that we can sustain from a global city? That's the question that has come my way.
Well, listen, my experience of global cities is limited to the Gulf, and not even all of them, number one. And I don't have any prevention against the idea of global cities, because simply they exist, and the world goes in a certain direction. And probably it will not change direction in spite of some events that happened, which is not only the calamity of the coronavirus, but also the calamity of Trump. But anyway, I think also that the global cities not necessarily will continue to destroy the locality, because at the end, if they are competing, they are competing on specificities. And the differences between a global city like São Paulo in Brazil or Doha is based on the specific local economy, local specificities, and so on. So it is also possible theoretically that a certain balance between locality and globality can be possible in the future. Okay, so not necessarily one has to destroy the rest to survive, and the other one has to resist from the first in order to survive. And this is the other thing is that definitely they are not sustainable, and they are not sustainable for the simple reasons that the normal traditional settlements were based on the idea of survival, on the idea of using the resources in a careful way, and so on. These cities are based, on the contrary, on the consumerism that is a consumerism of not necessarily consumes in reality. So what can I say? That I don't like them. This is the reality. But there are some possible trends that maybe would suggest that there are interesting possible evolutions. And one, I just give you an information, a small detail. In Italy, in the 2 months of the lockdown, we saved $34 billion or euros, which is the same thing, which is an enormous amount of money. It means that people didn't need to spend that money, you know. So most of the money that people consume is for consumes that are not necessary at all. So probably we have learned something also out of that, and we will change a bit our behavior in the future, and that will affect also our cities.
Yeah, there is a question from somebody from the Sindh Building Control Authority. I'm not exactly, well, I'll just read it out as it has been sent. It says, this question is directed to Kamil Khan Sahab, but we cannot pull down obsolete buildings in Karachi due to their architectural and historical value. Could the SBCA do that? Oh gosh. And he is actually, his name is Faratullah Qureshi, and he's from the Sindh Building Control Authority, the SBCA. I hope he's not asking you permission to do that. I'm not sure what he means, but that is a question for Kamil Sahab.
Well, I don't know what I can say about this. If it's for you to protect your heritage and make sure that these things are not pulled down, if they are of heritage value, this is a question for you in Sindh, the control authorities, to face. If you value your heritage, if you think that it has something from which you can benefit, and it has, then you have to protect it. It's what else can I say?
I asked. Maria, it's already, we're over 2 hours, and I'm sure our panelists have given us a lot of time. I would like you to thank them as the host. I just want to say a few last words that for me it's been an absolute pleasure and this conversation hasn't finished. It's almost like it's just started and I knew that it's not really going to go anywhere with a specific result, but it was important to start it and to see how different people are approaching the idea of urban design and urban development. I think each one of the panelists could have a full 2-hour discussion on this, really. But I think some of the things that are being reiterated is that, yes, some people will go back to the way things were, try to go back to the way things were. Some people have found it refreshing and they won't. I think the majority will change somewhat their consumer patterns, as Attilio has said, about the billions of euros that were saved by people, and many will realize that they didn't need to spend that money, and so might think about it again. It has affected certainly the global economy, but at the same time, it might have a positive impact on our consumption and therefore pollution and the rubbish heaps that we keep creating. So it'll have a better, hopefully, an environmental impact. I like to be the eternal optimist as opposed to the pessimistic ideas. So, call me stupid. And I think, Maria, thank you for organizing this, not just the seminar, the one, like I said, I happened to be in Karachi and saw that. And you were able to bring many, many issues to the fore for people who were born and brought up over there in Karachi specifically, and to other cities as well, where the citizens had never really understood their own, where they lived. So do you know your city? And in this particular webinar, you brought people from diverse geographical areas of Glasgow and Trani, and Lahore, and yourself in Karachi, me in Dubai, to start to ask questions about, is there a common thread running through the idea of urban development? Are there things that we can learn? Ashraf Salama has spoken about the importance of that interdisciplinary attitude towards planning and understanding spaces, whether they're conceived, perceived, and lived, to look at different fields of study. Attilio mentioned that as well, that the logos and these the metis and logos, they were divided up and everybody worked in that little cocoon. But now, where there's more of a cross-pollination, which is a good thing, because that's how you understand, that's how people are. People are organisms, and cities are organisms with so many different whether it's history or architecture or building economics and myriad other things, cultural identity, for example, that comes into the way people use a city. So I think we've just touched upon all of these things, but I think it's important to see that on a do you know your global city, this concept of disconnect and discontent, although it is a subjective title of the webinar, how do we address it? How do we study it? Can we come up with future speculations or questions? So it's been very interesting for me. But Maria, I'd like you to say some last words before we close out, and to thank all the esteemed my teachers and the person who has studied and researched the city that I live in, Professor Salama. So, Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Zarmeene, for these closing remarks of yours. When we kind of started off, I was aware that we were more on a speculative journey, and with the kind of panelists that we have bringing in their own experiences and their understanding, which is quite deep-rooted in wherever they are located. There was just this notion of trying to understand what the current times is. And since we are there right in the thick of things, I am sure that we do not have a particular response or a theory or an ideology or a norm as of yet to where we are or how we can be. all I can say is maybe we can be more humane, to what all that we are doing. And there is more empathy that is there. And of course, that some kind of sense prevails in the common sense that has been talked about and touched by all of our panelists. I am, as ADA, I'm deeply honored to have all of you on board, and would like to really extend my thanks to have given us so much of time and shared your point of views, which is just the beginning of the story, I believe. I think we can take this conversation much further in many tangential ways. We have not broached the subject on communication. We have not talked about education. We have not talked about I had two questions here with me, sitting with me, that I needed to ask from Ashraf. How education will unfold itself.
If we have a few minutes, can we possibly ask those questions? We'll have to ask the panelists.
If Ashraf still has the time and the patience to be with us, of course, because the audience is there.
Okay.
Please go ahead, Ashraf.
Yes. So the question is about education, you mean?
Yeah.
Architecture.
And architecture in particular.
Okay. I think definitely in light of course, architecture education is struggling everywhere in the world in terms of its position within the university system. Because that notion of architecture as art, architecture as science, architecture as social act, architecture as this. So architects keep defining and redefining themselves all the time. And probably we are the only group of professionals that keep talking about what architecture is. You don't hear medical doctors saying what medicine is, or lawyers saying what law is. Architects keep saying what architecture is. It's good and bad. It's good in the sense of richness and complexity. And it's bad because it generates negative impressions and negative perception from the public toward architects. So if you ask somebody in the street, who is the architect? People will respond to you, those people who draw nice drawings. So the majority of people in the street will do this. And I think this is a failure from the profession itself in presenting itself to the public. You don't see, and this is a bit negative, but you don't see somebody bargaining with a lawyer or with a dentist, but you see people bargaining with the architect. Why? Because they don't know what they are doing. And I think that professions failed to communicate that to the public. I'm talking about professional organizations. Same thing when we project it to education. Education still places emphasis on the egoistic architect or pragmatist architect. Either an architect who say, I give the people what I want, or another type who says, I give the people what they want. Okay, and there has to be a room to balance these attitudes and perception of the role of the architect. There are many other roles emerging now, and I think they have not reached yet the global south geographically in terms of how architects can play good roles in terms of being advocates of specific communities, being facilitators of needs and wants of specific groups of people, and whether education can simulate these roles beyond the typical modernist architect who's sitting on a drawing table with a tie and a white shirt that you see in many books. So can we move from that? Can we move away from that? So this is what I can say now about education, but I can talk more later.
You know, there is one, Maria, I just want to say one really quick thing. I was laughing when Ashraf said we failed as a profession to present ourselves properly. When I was doing the research for the monograph on Kamil Khan Mumtaz, it's hilarious because even now, if I go back and try and visit some of the places to keep up with, the changes that have happened, in Pakistan, there hasn't been a single single case where if I say, oh, so Kamil Khan Mumtaz was your architect, or, you know, whoever was your architect, people will say, yes, he was my architect, but I designed the house. Every single housewife, every single owner or the person says, yes, he was the architect, but I designed it. So this thing about, you know, are they in communication with you, and that communication that you conveyed and they were able to successfully build, that makes them an architect. But of course, it's a collaborative experience. But yeah, I just remembered that it's every single one of them. They don't recognize the architect as a designer. He just has his name on paper.
Everybody is an architect in our country, but the architect.
But the architect. 100%.
But Ashraf, you have given me you have actually touched a nerve that I've been working on, and you've given me a splendid idea on where to take this talk further, and I'll be in touch with you. You are not done with ADA yet. But thank you, all of you. Atilio, thank you so very much. Kamil Khan Mumtaz Saab, thank you so very much. And of course, Ashraf Salama joining us from UK. Thank you all for this absolutely wonderful conversation that has many tangents, and we will come back further with probably some threads of this conversation, take them further with more of our friends joining us. Thank you all so very much. Thank you. Thank you, Zarmine. Thank you.